Hello, I'm Jim Walsh, Senior Energy Policy Analyst with Food and Water Watch, and I am here to talk to you today about the new industry scams that the fossil fuel industry is pushing in Congress and around the country. And as fossil fuel driven climate change accelerates, the science is really clear that we need to move off of fossil fuels in the next decade if we hope to avoid runaway climate chaos. To do this, we must replace fossil fuels in our energy, transportation, and building sectors with clean, renewable energy. We must end new fossil fuel infrastructure, stop manufacturing of single use plastics, and end fossil fuel exports. Expectedly, the fossil fuel industry is aggressively pushing a narrative that supposes they are at the center of the energy transition. And this narrative envisions a world with expanding fossil fuel usage under the guise of addressing the climate crisis and ignores the other impacts fossil fuels have on frontline communities suffering from water and air pollution. The primary industry scams I'm going to talk about today are hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and carbon offset schemes. And some policymakers and even the public are buying into this disinformation campaign that will undermine real progress we need to address the climate crisis. And understanding these scams is the first step in fighting them. It's important to remember when looking at fossil fuel industry scams is the industry is constantly trying to narrow the focus of the discussion on fossil fuels while perpetuating a narrative that focuses on individual action and away from collective action and government control that's needed to phase out fossil fuels. Now, the first scam I'm going to discuss is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as CCUS or just CCS, this is a relatively unproven and very expensive scheme that pretends as though the only problem with fossil fuels is the fact they emit greenhouse gases. Now, don't get me wrong, the fossil fuel industry is the leading cause of global warming, but as we know all too well, greenhouse gases are not the only problem with fossil fuels. The idea behind CCUS is that we can capture CO2 at smokestacks, at coal and gas power plants to mitigate the impacts that this destructive industry has, and then utilize that CO2 for other purposes. But in reality, CCUS makes things worse for our planet and frontline communities while diverting resources away from clean energy infrastructure, which is actually more effective and more affordable than CCUS. In short, CCS will not prevent climate change from spiraling out of control, and worse yet, it'll allow localized health impacts from the fossil fuel industry to continue and even increase. And due to the significant problems of CCUS, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council actually rejected carbon capture as a technology that would provide any benefit to communities. And so it's important to dig in on why that is. And one of the concerns is the expense. The DOE, Department of Energy, has spent billions attempting to demonstrate the feasibility of carbon capture technology. And between the US and Europe and over a decade of investments, there's only 12 CCUS facilities in operation. And the flagship US facility, Petronova in Texas, was built with $1 billion of DOE subsidies. And the plant was plagued by technical problems, cost overruns, and was actually shut down in 2020, never meeting the projected goals for carbon capture that it was supposed to. Now, carbon capture rates at power plants is at best 39% when you look at the complete emissions inventory and not just what happens to be coming out of the smokestack. This is because there are leaks throughout the system, as well as emissions from the energy that powers the actual carbon capture equipment. And to make matters worse, the primary market for captured carbon is a process called enhanced oil recovery. This is where oil drillers will actually inject carbon dioxide into the earth as a way of squeezing out oil to increase production. And the industry is going as far as to claiming this is low carbon or blue oil and calling it carbon neutral in some instances. And this undermines any supposed benefit of carbon capture might have from capturing CO2 at smokestacks by using it to extract fossil fuels that you're going to burn elsewhere and emit more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And in addition to enhanced oil recovery, the industry actually has plans for the utilization of CO2. They're proposing to refine CO2 into fuels the industry likes to refer to as advanced transportation or advanced aviation fuels. And aside from the obvious problems of converting CO2 into fuels that will then burn and release CO2, the industry tries to tout these as also as carbon neutral fuels, despite the flaws in this reasoning. Another scheme the industry is pushing is refining CO2 into feedstocks for plastics and touting this as a way to make plastic without relying on fossil fuel extraction. This not only ignores the fact that the source of CO2 comes from burning fossil fuels in the first place, but ignores the literal oceans of waste of plastic that is in the food we eat, the water we drink, and even the air we breathe. And beyond that, you continue to have serious health impacts because of air and water pollution near refineries that are predominantly located in low-income communities. And the other fundamental problem with the utilization part of carbon capture, utilization, and storage is it creates value for CO2, which is really a fossil fuel industry waste product. So this encourages the production of more CO2 because there's more profit incentive now of burning fossil fuels because you can sell this waste product elsewhere. Furthermore, the utilization pathway will create an entirely new segment of the economy that is reliant on fossil fuel development, because those industrial polluters that are now buying the CO2 to refine into other products will employ people and create jobs in this dirty energy economy instead of providing it in a clean energy economy. This will make the transition off fossil fuels even more costly and difficult to achieve. Now, some people have questions about direct capture of CO2 from the atmosphere. Instead of attaching CCS equipment to a power plant, you would just attempt to pull it out of the air. And the idea that we're going to address the climate crisis by pulling carbon dioxide directly out of the air is very fanciful. The United States emits roughly 5 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere every year. But to remove just 1 billion tons of that through direct air capture would take nearly the entire energy output of the United States. And so meanwhile, these schemes continue to facilitate increasing drilling and fracking. And there are other significant risks associated with CCS, including well failures during injection or a blowout that could release large amounts of CO2. And leaks from storage locations, which could contaminate groundwater and soil or cause earthquakes at injection sites. And so there's just a litany of problems with the idea of capturing carbon from the atmosphere. And really, it is nothing other than a scam to perpetuate the continuation of fossil fuels and greenwash this dirty energy industry. The newest fossil fuel industry scam is hydrogen. This effort to greenwash this dirty, polluting industry is really disgraceful. The industry is running around touting hydrogen as a zero waste solution, but the truth is far more insidious. The industry sees hydrogen as a surefire way to lock us into more fossil fuel dependency by creating new markets for fracked gas and delaying the move towards electrification, transportation, electricity, and buildings. 95% of hydrogen is produced from fossil fuels, and that's done through a process called steam reforming methane. And in this process, methane is put under pressure with steam to facilitate a chemical reaction that separates the hydrogen from carbon atoms in methane. And then the carbon combines with the oxygen in the atmosphere, forming CO2, and hydrogen is left over. What's concerning is new research from scientists at Cornell and Stanford actually outline that fossil fuel hydrogen, even when coupled with carbon capture and storage technology, has a larger greenhouse gas emission footprint than coal. And so building out hydrogen infrastructure is the equivalent of building a new energy system that would be worse than coal. Now, this hydrogen coupled with CCS technology is referred to blue hydrogen and is sometimes referred to as low carbon or decarbonized hydrogen. And despite the huge emissions associated with blue hydrogen, the fossil fuel industry is pitching blue hydrogen as a way to make hydrogen sustainable from fossil fuels, just literally ignoring the climate change impacts, the public health impacts, environmental and health impacts that come from the development and production and use of hydrogen. Factory farms are also looking to cash in on the hydrogen greenwash, proposing to use methane from factory farms to create hydrogen, using the same process to create hydrogen from methane that's used by the fossil fuel industry. The only difference is that factory farm gas to hydrogen is used to prop up factory farms that are poisoning the air and water of nearby communities. Now, hydrogen can potentially play a role in our energy system moving forward, but we need to be very careful about how we do that and where we do that. And hydrogen extracted from water using solar and wind energy is often referred to as green hydrogen. And if we use hydrogen in our system, it should be green hydrogen. But how and where it's used is important. We have to ensure that green hydrogen is not being used to prop up fossil fuel usage. The industry likes to talk about blue hydrogen being a bridge fuel to a green hydrogen economy, building the infrastructure for hydrogen with the idea that we're going to use only green hydrogen in this infrastructure. And because the infrastructure for hydrogen can be utilized no matter the source of the hydrogen. It's also important to recognize for many of hydrogen's current proposed applications, direct electrification is the most efficient use of renewable electricity and can achieve greater greenhouse gas reductions sooner than by utilizing green hydrogen. So building out hydrogen infrastructure for non-essential sectors is a grave mistake and will waste resources and undermine the transition to clean energy by diverting those renewable resources to by diverting those renewable resources to hydrogen production instead of just direct electrification to begin with. And the way we extract energy from hydrogen is also important. Hydrogen combustion is wasteful and also produces harmful air pollutants, whereas using fuel cells to extract energy from hydrogen only emits water and heat. And so due to these factors, green hydrogen should really only be used in fuel cells and reserved for energy applications where no electrification alternative is available. And the final scam I want to talk about is carbon offsets. And this is one of the longest running fossil fuel industry scams. In general, offsets are a regulatory model that where polluters are able to purchase offsets to pollute the environment due to someone reducing pollution elsewhere. The idea is there is a net zero of pollution, so everything turns out great. But in reality, carbon offset programs can actually increase emissions of greenhouse gases, as well as increase emissions of harmful co-pollutants like PM 2.5 and ozone precursors. And these increases tend to happen in environmental justice communities where major sources of pollution tend to be located and tend to purchase these credits to allow for ongoing and continuing emissions. It's important to recognize as well as the offsets are not a regulatory policy as the fossil fuel industry likes to talk about them, but they're actually a deregulatory policy. That's because the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act set a principle that nobody has an inherent right to pollute. If you want to pollute, then you have to get a permit where the public has an ability to weigh in and regulators can enforce those pollution limits. Offset programs turn this model of regulation on its head, saying that everyone can pollute as long as we pay for it. And we're seeing these market-based offset programs not just helping benefit the fossil fuel industry who's able to actually purchase these credits instead of reducing emissions, but they're also propping up big agricultural interests who have long squeezed farm income and drained rural economy. That is because these carbon offsets, when generated at farms, are more likely and more feasible for larger operations and leave out smaller farms and farmers of color who are already underserved by USDA programs. The benefits of carbon payments wouldn't even extend to organic or other sustainable operations that have already invested in effective regenerative practices. And carbon offset schemes undermine our ability to address the climate crisis by pretending the Earth is this endless sponge for absorbing fossil fuel carbon. And if this were true, we wouldn't have a climate crisis in the first place. But in reality, there are several reasons that offsets are ineffective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. First, methods for measuring soil carbon are really underdeveloped. They're inconsistent, and there's significant flaws in the reasoning that when you consider the fact that fossil fuel emissions were permanently sequestered in the earth and are now being replaced by temporary sequestration of biological sources. And so this creates significant issues for the long-term counting of carbon in our atmosphere if we're looking to get I'm going to stop and redo that. Carbon offset schemes undermine our ability to address the climate crisis by pretending the Earth is an endless sponge for absorbing fossil fuel carbon. But if this were true, we wouldn't have a climate crisis in the first place. And there are several reasons that offsets are ineffective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. First and foremost, the methods for measuring soil carbon sequestration are undeveloped, inconsistent, and are influenced by specific climate and geographies. And so, really, we don't know how long carbon can be sequestered in biological sources or how much carbon is actually sequestered in biological sources to begin with. And establishing carbon offset supposes that this biological sequestration in soil is permanent and quantifiable. But the pollution coming out of smokestacks is permanent. And it used to be permanently sequestered, but now it is released in the atmosphere. There's also concerns about a concept called additionality. And for offsets to mean anything at all, there needs to be evidence that a given program has actually caused specific carbon absorbing actions to take place that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And it's impossible to do this, which is why offset programs create credits for actions that were already happening or would have likely happened anyways. The Stockholm Environment Institute issued a report that found that 75% of offsets issued under the Kyoto Protocol were non-additional, means that they would have happened even without the program in place. Similarly, a USDA study looking at conservation tillage and offsets related with that found that only 50% was actually additional. The carbon markets are also ripe for fraud. In a Nature study that identified hundreds of millions of dollars in profits that were actually made by Ukrainian and Russian companies selling fraudulent credits into the EU emissions trading system. An analysis by MIT and ProPublica found that a preservation group cashed in on $6 million for forest offsets that prevent them from logging a forest that they were not likely to start logging anyway, which represents 600,000 credits, each worth a metric ton of CO2 that polluters were able to purchase and dump into the atmosphere. Addressing the climate crisis means moving rapidly off of fossil fuels. If policymakers and the public buys into these schemes that the fossil fuel industry is putting forward, we will never be able to address the climate crisis in any meaningful way. We will bring harm to environmental justice and frontline communities who are suffering from the impacts of fossil fuels. We need all of us to come together to fight for these scams and push for real solutions that are going to keep fossil fuels in the ground and help facilitate a just and equitable transition off of fossil fuels. Thank you.